Hey guys, tonight you're waking up in 1830s China, and your morning tea tastes like poison. There's opium floating in your breakfast porridge. We'll get to why that opium is about to destroy an entire empire. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Congratulations! You've just opened your eyes in Imperial China, and everything is about to go catastrophically wrong. Not because of war, not because of famine, but because of a plant that makes people feel really, really good, and then kills them slowly. The year is 1838, and you're living through what will become known as the Opium Crisis, though nobody's calling it that yet. Right now, it's just Tuesday, and your neighbor is passed out in his doorway again, drooling onto the cobblestones with that glassy-eyed stare. It means he's been hitting the pipe a little too hard. Your house smells like smoke and disappointment. Not the good kind of smoke from cooking fires or incense burning at the temple, but that thick, sweet, cloying smoke that clings to everything and makes your throat burn. It's opium smoke, and it's everywhere. Seeping through the walls from next door, where the Chun family's eldest son has been smoking for 3 days straight. Drifting up from the basement, where your landlord runs a small den. Hanging in the air outside because half the city is either smoking, selling, or desperately trying to quit. You stumble to your feet and immediately regret it. Your head pounds because the air is so thick with opium smoke that even non-smokers get a contact high just walking down the street. It's like living inside a giant drug den, which, let's be clear, is exactly what you're doing. The entire city of Canton has basically become one massive opium distribution center, and you're just trying to buy vegetables without accidentally getting stoned. The morning light filtering through your paper windows shows you exactly how bad things have gotten. Your silver coins, the ones you've been saving for months, are worth half what they were last week. Not because of inflation, but because everyone's trading their silver for opium. The British merchants down at the docks are literally reversing China's entire economy, one pipe at a time. For centuries, silver flowed into China because everyone wanted Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain. Now it's flowing out, chasing British opium, and the imperial treasury is starting to panic. You walk outside and nearly trip over Mrs. Wang's son. He's maybe 16, sprawled on the ground with his opium pipe still clutched in his hand, completely unconscious. His mother steps over him like he's a puddle. This is normal now. Sons, fathers, government officials, even some of the temple monks, all chasing the dragon, as they call it, all slowly destroying themselves while British merchants count their profits. The streets of Canton in 1838 are a study in contradictions. Magnificent temples sit next to ramshackle opium dens. Wealthy merchants' houses overlook alleyways where addicts fight over the last bits of drug residue scraped from old pipes. You can smell the opium cooking from blocks away, that sweet, acrid scent mixing with the normal city smells of sewage, cooking food, and unwashed bodies. It's like someone took a normal Chinese city and soaked it in liquid addiction. Your breakfast consists of rice porridge that tastes faintly of opium smoke, because everything tastes of opium smoke now. Even the water has a slightly bitter aftertaste, because the drug dealers have been dumping their waste into the wells. You chew mechanically while watching a group of British merchants walk past your window, laughing and counting money. They're staying in the foreign quarter, the only place where non-Chinese are allowed to live and work, but their product is everywhere. The British have figured out something diabolical. For decades, they've been buying massive amounts of Chinese goods, silk, tea, porcelain, paying in silver, because China doesn't want anything Britain makes. This created a huge trade deficit. Britain was essentially bleeding silver to feed its tea habit, and tea had become so important to British life that the average London worker spent 5% of their household budget on it. 5%. That's like spending your entire car payment on tea. But then someone had a brilliant, evil idea. What if we could get the Chinese addicted to something? Something we control? Something that would make them pay us instead of the other way around? Enter opium. The British East India Company had massive opium plantations in Bengal, India. They were already producing the stuff for medical use, but medical opium is a small market. Recreational opium, though, recreational opium could be huge. Especially if you could get an entire empire hooked on it. You finish your bitter breakfast and head out to buy vegetables, but the market is chaos. Half the vendors are too high to function properly. The other half are desperately trying to get silver to buy more opium. Prices change hourly because nobody knows what anything is worth anymore. A cabbage that cost 2 copper coins yesterday costs 4 today, but only if you pay in silver. If you try to pay in copper, it's 8 coins because the vendor needs silver to buy his next fix. The whole economic system is falling apart. China's traditional trade surplus, the thing that's made the empire wealthy and powerful for centuries, has completely reversed. Instead of the world's silver flowing into China, China's silver is flowing out to British merchants. By 1838, China is importing more than it's exporting for the first time in living memory. The imperial government is watching its entire economic foundation crumble, one opium pipe at a time. You manage to buy some wilted vegetables from a vendor whose hands shake so badly he can barely count change. His eyes are bloodshot and watery, and he keeps scratching at his arms like something is crawling under his skin. These are the early signs of opium withdrawal, and you're seeing them everywhere. People who can't afford their next fix, people who are trying to quit, people who are slowly dying from the drug but can't stop smoking it. The really insidious thing about the opium trade is how it's organized. The British can't legally import opium into China because it's been banned since 1729. So instead, they've created this elaborate smuggling network that's more efficient than most legal trade operations. Ships carrying opium anchor at Linton Island, just outside Chinese jurisdiction. The opium gets transferred to floating warehouses, then loaded onto smaller Chinese boats with names like Fast Crabs and Scrambling Dragons. These boats navigate the Pearl River's narrow channels, bribing officials and avoiding patrols, delivering their poison to eager customers throughout southern China. By the time you get home from the market, your clothes reek of opium smoke and your head is pounding from the contact high. You pass 3 more unconscious addicts on your street, including the local tax collector. This is actually a serious problem, because when government officials are addicted to opium, they become useless at collecting taxes, enforcing laws, or basically doing anything except finding their next fix. The imperial court in Beijing is finally starting to understand how bad things have gotten. Reports are flooding in from provincial governors describing entire cities where half the adult male population is addicted to opium. Military units where soldiers are too high to drill. Government offices where officials spend their days smoking instead of working. The Qing Dynasty, which has ruled China for nearly 2 centuries, is watching its authority dissolve in opium smoke. Your neighbor's son stumbles past your window, clearly looking for money to buy more opium. His family has already sold most of their furniture, their good clothes, even their grandmother's jewelry. Now he's eyeing your house with the calculating look of someone who's considering burglary. Opium addiction doesn't just destroy the user, it destroys entire families. Wives sell their wedding dowries to buy their husband's next fix. Children go hungry because their parents spend food money on drugs. Elderly parents are abandoned because their opium-addicted children can't care for them. The social fabric of Chinese society is unraveling. Confucian values of family loyalty, respect for elders, and personal responsibility are are no match for chemical addiction. Sons who should be caring for their aging parents are instead passed out in opium dens. Husbands who should be providing for their families are selling everything they own to feed their habits. The drug is attacking the very foundation of Chinese civilization. You lock your door and settle in for the evening, but sleep is difficult when your neighbor is having withdrawal-induced nightmares next door. He's screaming, crying, begging someone to make the pain stop. Opium withdrawal is brutal. Your skin feels like it's crawling with insects. Your stomach cramps so badly you can't stand up straight. You sweat and shiver simultaneously. Your bones ache like they're breaking. And the psychological craving is overwhelming. A desperate need that makes you willing to do anything, steal anything, betray anyone, just to make it stop. This is what the British have done to China. They've turned an entire civilization into a nation of desperate addicts, all so they can balance their trade deficit and keep drinking tea. But things are about to change. In Beijing, the Daogong Emperor has finally decided that enough is enough. He's going to appoint a special commissioner to deal with the opium problem. A man named Lin Zexu, who has a reputation for being completely incorruptible and absolutely ruthless when it comes to enforcing imperial law. Lin Zexu doesn't know it yet, but he's about to trigger a war that will humiliate China and reshape the entire global order. All because British merchants couldn't figure out a legal way to pay for their tea. You drift off to sleep listening to the sounds of a civilization in crisis. Somewhere in the distance, someone is crying for their next fix. Someone else is counting silver coins, preparing for tomorrow's drug purchase. And in the foreign quarter, British merchants are planning how to expand their profitable poison trade even further into the Chinese interior. Tomorrow, you'll wake up to the same opium-soaked reality. But unknown to you, change is coming. Lin Zexu is already traveling south from Beijing, armed with extraordinary powers from the emperor and a determination to end the opium trade once and for all. What he doesn't understand is that he's not just fighting drug dealers. He's fighting the entire British Empire, and the British Empire has guns. Let's talk about how we got to this point, because China didn't become a nation of opium addicts overnight. This crisis has been building for decades, and it starts with something completely innocent: tea. You wake up the next morning and your first thought isn't about opium, it's about breakfast. But as you stumble toward your kitchen, you notice that even your tea tastes different now. Not because there's opium in it, though there might be, but because the entire tea trade has been corrupted by the drug business. The same merchants who bring you your morning tea are the ones flooding your city with poison. The British obsession with tea is what started this whole mess. By the 1830s, Britain has become a nation of tea addicts. Not the destructive kind like opium addiction, but still a genuine chemical dependency. The average British worker spends 5% of their income on tea. 5%. That's like spending your entire phone bill on coffee every month. Tea has become so central to British life that stopping the supply would probably cause riots in London. But here's the problem. China produces the world's best tea, and China doesn't want anything Britain makes. British wool? China has better silk. British manufactured goods? Chinese craftsmen make superior products. British weapons? China has been making gunpowder since the Qing Dynasty. For centuries, this meant that Britain had to pay for Chinese goods with silver, creating a massive trade imbalance. You sip your morning tea and try to imagine being so addicted to something that you'd destabilize an entire foreign empire just to keep drinking it. But that's essentially what Britain has done. Rather than accept that they couldn't afford their tea habit, they decided to create Chinese drug addicts to pay for it. The Canton system, established in 1757, was China's attempt to control foreign trade while still profiting from it. All foreign merchants had to work through licensed Chinese intermediaries, called the Kohong. These middlemen held monopolistic control over foreign trade, serving as a buffer between Western traders and Chinese officials. Foreign merchants were confined to specific areas during trading seasons and subject to numerous restrictions on their movements and activities. You walk past the foreign quarter on your way to work, and you can see how the system is supposed to work. The Western merchants live in their designated compounds. They conduct their business through approved Chinese partners, and they're supposed to follow Chinese law. But the system is breaking down because of opium. The drug trade requires smuggling, bribery, and violence. It can't operate within the legal framework of the Canton system. The Kohong merchants are caught in an impossible position. They're legally responsible for the foreign merchants' behavior, but they can't control the opium trade without destroying their own profits. Many of them are secretly involved in the smuggling operation, taking bribes to look the other way while British drugs flood into China. Others are trying to stay legitimate, but finding themselves squeezed out by competitors who are willing to deal in narcotics. Your work today involves copying documents from one of the Kohong firms, and you can see the strain on your employer's face. He's trying to run a legitimate trading business, importing legal goods and exporting tea and silk, but his competitors are making 10 times more money by facilitating the opium trade. Every day, he loses market share to merchants who are willing to poison their own people for profit. The British have created a system where following the law means economic suicide. If you want to compete in the Canton trade, you have to be involved with opium, directly or indirectly. This corrupts everything, turning honest merchants into drug dealers and forcing government officials to choose between enforcing the law and feeding their families. Meanwhile, the addiction crisis is getting worse. You see it everywhere now. The man who sells you noodles for lunch is clearly using, his hands shaking as he tries to serve customers. The government clerk who's supposed to process your work permit is passed out at his desk, an opium pipe still warm beside him. Even some of the temple priests are showing signs of addiction, their spiritual duties forgotten in favor of chasing the next high. The medical consequences of widespread opium use are becoming apparent. Chronic users develop what doctors call opium face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance that makes them look decades older than their actual age. Their teeth fall out from poor nutrition and neglect. Their skin becomes sallow and unhealthy. Many develop chronic coughs from smoking the drug, a hacking, wet sound that echoes through the streets at all hours. But the physical addiction is just part of the problem. Opium use creates psychological changes that are destroying Chinese society. Users become completely focused on their next fix, unable to think about anything else. They lose interest in work, family, and social obligations. Traditional Chinese values of hard work, family loyalty, and social responsibility become meaningless when measured against the overwhelming need for more opium. You spend your afternoon walking through different neighborhoods, and you can see how the crisis varies by social class. In wealthy areas, opium addiction is hidden behind closed doors. Rich families can afford to keep their addicted members supplied with high-quality drugs and private places to use them. The addiction is still destructive, but it's less visible. In poor neighborhoods, the crisis is out in the open. Addicts lie in doorways, begging for money or trying to sell their last possessions. Families crowd together in single rooms because they've sold their furniture to buy drugs. Children wander the streets unsupervised because their parents are too high to care for them. The social support systems that traditionally helped poor families survive are collapsing under the weight of mass addiction. The economic impact is staggering. China's traditional trade surplus has completely reversed. For the first time in centuries, more silver is leaving China than entering it. This creates monetary instability throughout the empire. Prices fluctuate wildly as the silver supply shrinks. Local governments struggle to collect taxes because their tax base is either addicted to opium or financially ruined by family members who are. You stop by a money changer's shop and listen to him explain the crisis to another customer. A silver tael that was worth 1,000 copper coins last year is now worth 1,600 because silver is flowing out of the country to pay for British opium. This inflation is devastating for ordinary Chinese people who earn their wages in copper but need silver for major purchases. The imperial government's response has been inadequate and contradictory. Opium has been officially banned since 1729, but enforcement has been sporadic and often corrupt. Local officials are either addicted themselves, being bribed by smugglers, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. Some have tried aggressive enforcement, conducting raids and making arrests, but the trade simply moves to other locations. By evening, you're walking home through streets that reek of opium smoke and desperation. The crisis has reached a tipping point where it's destroying the social and economic foundations of Chinese civilization. Something has to be done, but what? The emperor's solution is about to arrive in Canton. Lin Zexu, a scholar official with an impeccable reputation for integrity and competence, has been appointed imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to end the opium trade. But Lin doesn't fully understand what he's up against. He's not just fighting Chinese drug dealers and corrupt officials. He's challenging the entire British imperial system, which depends on the opium trade to maintain its economic dominance in Asia. You fall asleep to the sound of your neighbor coughing up blood, a wet, painful sound that speaks to the physical toll of long-term opium use. Tomorrow will bring more of the same. Addicts stumbling through the streets, families destroyed by drugs, silver flowing out of China to pay for British poison. But change is coming. Lin Zexu is already on his way south, and he's bringing the full authority of the imperial government with him. What he doesn't know is that when he confronts the British merchants, he'll be starting a war that China can't win. The real tragedy of the opium crisis isn't just the individual suffering of addicts and their families. It's the systematic destruction of a civilization that had flourished for thousands of years. The British didn't just create drug addicts. They created a failed state, a society so corrupted by addiction that it couldn't defend itself when the warships came. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in 1838, the crisis is still building toward its climax. The British are still smuggling opium through their efficient network of floating warehouses and fast boats. Chinese addicts are still trading their silver for British drugs. And somewhere in Beijing, Lin Zexu is preparing for the most important mission of his life. He has no idea that he's about to trigger the first modern drug war, a conflict that will reshape the global balance of power and begin what Chinese historians call the century of humiliation. All because Britain couldn't figure out how to pay for tea without creating a nation of opium addicts. Meanwhile, the smuggling operation continues with clockwork efficiency. British ships anchor at Lincoln Island, safely outside Chinese territorial waters. The opium gets transferred to floating storage vessels with innocent-sounding names like Hercules and Cambridge. From there, smaller Chinese boats take over, navigating the complex network of rivers and channels that lead into the Chinese interior. The boats themselves are marvels of criminal engineering. The fast crabs are sleek, narrow vessels designed for speed and maneuverability. They can outrun Chinese patrol boats and navigate shallow waters where larger ships can't follow. The scrambling dragons are broader and can carry more cargo, but they're still fast enough to escape most government interference. You've seen these boats yourself, sliding through the water at dawn or dusk when visibility is low. They move like ghosts, their crews working in practiced silence. Everyone knows what they're carrying, but nobody talks about it openly. The boats represent something that shouldn't exist, a highly organized criminal enterprise that's more efficient than most legal businesses. The crews of these smuggling boats are mostly Chinese, men who've been pushed into the drug trade by economic necessity or addiction. Some are former fishermen whose traditional livelihood has been disrupted by the Opium Crisis. Others are addicts working off their debts to drug suppliers. A few are just criminals who see an opportunity for easy money. But the real profiteers are the British merchants who finance the operation. They live comfortably in the foreign quarter of Canton, insulated from the street-level consequences of their trade. To them, opium is just another commodity, like tea or silk. They don't see the addicts begging in the streets or the families destroyed by drugs. They see profit margins and market opportunities. These merchants have convinced themselves that they're providing a service that Chinese people want. If there wasn't demand for opium, they argue, there wouldn't be a market for it. This ignores the nature of addiction and the deliberate creation of that demand, but it allows them to sleep at night while their product destroys an entire civilization. The scale of the operation is staggering. By 1838, over 40,000 chests of opium are being smuggled into China annually. Each chest contains about 140 pounds of the drug, meaning that nearly 3 million pounds of opium are entering China every year. This represents a street value of millions of silver dollars, money that's flowing from Chinese addicts to British merchants. The logistics alone are impressive. The opium has to be grown in India, processed into smokable form, shipped to China, stored in floating warehouses, transferred to smaller boats, smuggled past government patrols, and distributed to dealers throughout southern China. Every step of this process requires coordination, bribes, and violence. It's a criminal enterprise that spans 2 continents and involves thousands of people. And it's all illegal. Every participant, from the British merchant financing the shipment to the Chinese dealer selling it on the street, is breaking the law. But the profits are so enormous that legal risks seem insignificant. A single successful opium shipment can make a merchant wealthy for life. The temptation is irresistible, especially when enforcement is sporadic and often corrupt. You spend your evening watching the harbor, where legitimate trade ships anchor alongside the floating opium warehouses. It's surreal to see legal and illegal commerce operating side by side, sometimes involving the same people. A merchant might spend his morning negotiating a legal contract for silk exports, then spend his afternoon arranging an illegal opium shipment. This normalization of crime is one of the most destructive aspects of the opium crisis. When everyone is breaking the law loses its meaning. When government officials are taking bribes, legitimate authority disappears. When addiction is everywhere, social norms collapse. China isn't just facing a drug problem. It's facing the complete breakdown of legal and social order. The British government's role in this crisis is complicated and hypocritical. Officially, the British government doesn't support the opium trade. Opium is strictly regulated in Britain itself, and British officials often speak publicly about the dangers of drug abuse. But the same government protects British merchants' right to trade freely and profits enormously from the taxes on opium exports from India. This allows Britain to have it both ways, condemning drug addiction while profiting from it. When Chinese officials complain about the opium trade, British diplomats respond that they can't control private merchants' business decisions. When British merchants demand protection for their illegal activities, the British government provides naval support and diplomatic pressure. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Britain would never tolerate foreign merchants smuggling addictive drugs into British cities, but they see nothing wrong with doing exactly that to China. They've convinced themselves that Chinese people are somehow different, that addiction and social destruction are acceptable as long as they happen to foreigners. This racist justification for the opium trade runs deep in British colonial thinking. Chinese civilization is portrayed as stagnant and corrupt. Therefore, Chinese suffering doesn't matter as much as British profits. Chinese law is dismissed as irrelevant because China isn't a Christian nation. Chinese sovereignty is ignored because China isn't powerful enough to enforce it. These attitudes will become crucial when Lin Zexu finally confronts the British merchants. They won't see him as a legitimate government official trying to enforce his country's laws. They'll see him as an obstacle to free trade, a representative of an inferior civilization that needs to be taught a lesson about the realities of global commerce. But that confrontation is still months away. For now, the crisis continues to build. More opium enters China every day. More Chinese people become addicted. More silver flows out of the country. The social and economic foundations of the Qing Dynasty continue to erode. You fall asleep listening to the sound of boats moving through the harbor, some carrying legal goods, others carrying illegal drugs, all part of the same corrupt system that's slowly destroying your country. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, but somewhere in the distance, change is coming. Lin Zexu is traveling south with the emperor's mandate to end the opium trade. He believes that moral authority and firm enforcement can solve the crisis. He's about to discover that he's not just fighting Chinese criminals and corrupt officials. He's challenging the British Empire itself, and the British Empire doesn't negotiate with people it considers inferior. The collision between Chinese moral authority and British military power is about to reshape the world. But that's a story for tomorrow night, when the stakes get even higher and the consequences even more devastating. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. The whole smuggling network runs on one thing that makes everything worse: corruption. You wake up the next morning and your landlord is counting silver coins at his kitchen table, more money than he's ever seen in his life. He's not a wealthy man, just a minor government clerk who's supposed to inspect cargo manifests at the docks. But those cargo manifests lie about everything, and your landlord gets paid handsomely to pretend he can't read. This is how the system works now. Everyone takes bribes because everyone needs silver to survive in an economy where silver is flowing out of the country faster than water through a broken dam. The harbor master takes money to look the other way when suspicious boats arrive at midnight. The tax collectors take cuts from merchants who are obviously smuggling something. Even the temple priests take donations that smell suspiciously like opium profits, then use that money to buy more incense to cover the drug smell during services. You walk to work past a government office where half the clerks are clearly high. They're supposed to be processing import licenses and tax documents, but they're moving like they're underwater, staring at paperwork for 10 minutes without reading a single character. One of them is using his official stamp to prop up his opium pipe because the desk is too uneven. These are the people responsible for enforcing China's laws, and they're too stoned to remember what laws exist. Your job today involves delivering messages between different merchant houses, and you get to see the corruption from every angle. The Qing merchants, who are supposed to control foreign trade, are completely compromised. Some of them are directly involved in opium smuggling, using their legal trading licenses as cover for drug operations. Others are being blackmailed by British merchants, who threaten to expose their illegal activities unless they cooperate with even bigger illegal activities. The British have created a perfect system of corruption. They start by offering small bribes for minor favors, just looking the other way while a boat unloads suspicious cargo. Once a Chinese official takes that first payment, they're compromised. The British can threaten to expose them unless they cooperate with larger operations. Before long, government clerks are actively helping smuggle opium, not because they want to destroy their country, but because they're trapped in a web of blackmail and financial dependency. You deliver a message to a customs inspector who's clearly struggling with his conscience. His hands shake as he reads the letter, and you can see the moral conflict written across his face. He knows he's betraying his oath and his country, but he also knows that his family will starve if he stops taking British money. The legitimate salary of a customs inspector can't compete with the inflation caused by silver shortages, so he needs opium bribes just to buy food for his children. This is the real genius of what the British have done. They haven't just created drug addicts, they've created an entire economy that depends on drug money. Government salaries become worthless when silver is flowing out of the country. Legitimate businesses can't compete with operations that don't pay taxes or follow regulations. Honest officials watch their families sink into poverty while corrupt colleagues live like lords. The corruption spreads like a disease because clean money isn't enough to survive anymore. A merchant who refuses to deal with opium finds himself unable to compete with merchants who use drug profits to undercut his prices. A government official who won't take bribes discovers that he can't afford to live on his legal salary. Even people who hate what's happening to their country find themselves forced to participate just to survive. You spend your afternoon in a tea house where merchants gather to discuss business, and the conversations are surreal. Men are openly talking about bribe schedules and payoff structures, discussing corruption like it's a normal part of commerce. One merchant explains how much it costs to buy a week of protection from harbor patrols. Another describes the going rate for customs officials to lose specific paperwork. They're not evil men, just businessmen adapting to a system where following the law means economic suicide. The British merchants encourage this corruption because it serves their purposes perfectly. Every Chinese official they compromise becomes an asset in their smuggling network. Every honest administrator they force out of business eliminates potential opposition to their operations. They're not just selling drugs, they're systematically destroying the Chinese government's ability to function. The human cost is staggering. You walk past a government compound where families used to live in modest comfort on official salaries. Now the buildings are crumbling because there's no money for maintenance. The officials' wives are selling their jewelry to buy rice because their husbands' legitimate income isn't enough to feed their families. Children who should be studying for imperial examinations are instead working as messengers for smuggling operations because that's the only way their families can earn money. The imperial examination system, which has provided competent administrators for over 1,000 years, is collapsing under the weight of corruption. Why spend years studying classics and poetry when you can make more money in a month of facilitating drug smuggling? Why pursue a government career that pays poverty wages when you can get rich by betraying your country? The entire system of merit-based administration is being replaced by a network of drug dealers and their collaborators. You eat dinner at a restaurant where the owner used to serve government officials and legitimate merchants. Now his customers are mostly smugglers and addicts, men who pay their bills with silver that reeks of opium smoke. The food tastes different because he can't afford quality ingredients on the reduced income from his shrinking legitimate clientele. Even the tea is bitter, probably mixed with lower-grade leaves to stretch the supply. The owner tells you about his dilemma while serving your meal. He knows his new customers are destroying Chinese society, but they're the only ones who can pay his prices. Legitimate merchants can't afford to eat out anymore because their businesses are being crushed by opium-funded competition. Government officials are eating at home because their salaries don't cover restaurant meals in the inflated economy. His choice is to serve drug dealers or go out of business. This is the moral trap that the opium crisis has created for ordinary Chinese people. Everyone knows the drug trade is wrong, but everyone is forced to participate in some way just to survive. The tea house owner serves smugglers. The boat builder repairs smuggling vessels. The cloth merchant sells fabric to dealers who use it to wrap opium shipments. No one can maintain moral purity when the entire economy runs on drug money. The British understand this perfectly. They've created a system where opposition to the opium trade means economic self-destruction. Chinese officials who try to enforce anti-opium laws find themselves isolated and impoverished. Merchants who refuse to deal with drug money watch their businesses fail. Even families who try to avoid the trade discover that their neighbors' opium connections make them more prosperous and socially influential. You spend your evening walking through different neighborhoods, and you can see how corruption varies by social class. In wealthy areas, the corruption is sophisticated and hidden. Rich families use their opium connections to gain political influence and business advantages. They don't sell drugs on street corners. They facilitate large-scale smuggling operations and launder the profits through legitimate businesses. In poor neighborhoods, the corruption is crude and desperate. People sell information about government patrols for a few copper coins. They provide hiding places for smuggled goods in exchange for enough money to buy their next meal. Children serve as lookouts and message carriers because their families need every possible source of income. The middle class is caught between these extremes, forced to choose between moral principles and economic survival. A shopkeeper might refuse to store opium for smugglers, but he'll sell goods to people who are obviously spending drug money. A clerk might not take bribes directly, but he'll overlook irregularities in paperwork because confronting them would cost him his job. This widespread corruption is destroying the social trust that holds Chinese civilization together. When everyone is breaking the law becomes meaningless. When government officials are criminals, legitimate authority disappears. When success comes from betraying your country rather than serving it, patriotism becomes a luxury that ordinary people can't afford. The Confucian values that have guided Chinese society for centuries are being systematically undermined. The idea that government officials should be moral exemplars becomes a joke when those officials are facilitating drug smuggling. The concept of family honor becomes meaningless when families prosper by poisoning their neighbors. The principle of social harmony collapses when everyone is competing to serve foreign drug dealers. You fall asleep listening to the sound of silver coins being counted next door, probably payment for another successful smuggling operation. Your landlord is getting rich by betraying his country, and he's not even ashamed of it anymore, because everyone else is doing the same thing. The corruption has become so normalized that honest behavior seems naive and impractical. But this normalization of crime and betrayal is creating the conditions for something much worse than individual moral failure. It's creating a society that can't defend itself against foreign aggression because its institutions have been gutted by corruption. When the time comes for China to confront the British Empire, it will discover that its government, military, and economy have all been compromised by the very people it's trying to fight. The next morning brings news that changes everything. Lin Zexu has arrived in Canton, and he's not playing by the usual rules. Unlike every other government official the British have encountered, Lin can't be bribed, threatened, or reasoned with. He sees the opium trade as a fundamental threat to Chinese civilization, and he has the emperor's authority to do whatever is necessary to stop it. You hear about Lin's arrival while buying vegetables from a vendor who's clearly nervous about something. Word is spreading through the city that the new imperial commissioner is different from previous officials. He's been conducting surprise inspections, arresting corrupt officials, and seizing opium supplies without warning. More importantly, he's immune to the usual methods of influence that the British use to control Chinese authorities. The British merchants in the foreign quarter are reportedly panicking because their network of bribed officials is suddenly useless. Lin doesn't care how much money they offer or what threats they make. He's operating on Confucian principles of moral duty and imperial loyalty, concepts that the British have never had to deal with in their previous negotiations with Chinese authorities. Lin's first actions in Canton are designed to demonstrate that the old system of corruption and accommodation is over. He's arrested over 1,600 Chinese opium dealers in his first week, more than previous officials captured in entire years. He's confiscated and destroyed tens of thousands of opium pipes, creating bonfires that can be seen from miles away. Most importantly, he's demanded that foreign merchants surrender all their opium stocks to the Chinese government for destruction. The British response is exactly what you'd expect from people who have grown accustomed to buying their way out of legal problems. They offer bribes that would make most Chinese officials wealthy for life. They threaten to withdraw their trade and crash the local economy. They appeal to their diplomatic contacts and demand the Chinese authorities negotiate rather than enforce the law. But Lin Zexu isn't most Chinese officials. He's spent 25 years building a reputation for incorruptibility and administrative competence. He's addressed problems ranging from piracy to flood control without ever taking a single illegal payment or compromising his principles. The British are about to discover that their usual methods of dealing with Chinese authority figures are completely ineffective against someone who actually believes in the laws he's sworn to enforce. You watch the tension building in the foreign quarter as British merchants realize they're facing something unprecedented. For decades, they've operated on the assumption that every Chinese official has a price and every law can be circumvented with sufficient money or pressure. Now they're confronting a man who views their entire enterprise as an assault on Chinese civilization and moral order. Lin's approach goes far beyond simple law enforcement. He understands that the Opium Crisis is a symptom of deeper problems in Chinese society, particularly the corruption and moral decay that have allowed foreign criminals to operate with impunity. His goal isn't just to stop drug smuggling, it's to restore the moral authority of the Chinese government and demonstrate that Western merchants can't buy their way out of consequences for their actions. The confrontation that's about to unfold between Lin Zexu and the British merchants represents more than a dispute over trade regulations. It's a clash between two completely different worldviews. Lin represents traditional Chinese values of moral governance and social responsibility. The British represent modern capitalist values of profit maximization and market freedom. Neither side fully understands the other's perspective, which makes compromise impossible. Lin sees the British as criminals who are poisoning Chinese society for money, and he can't comprehend how any civilized government would protect such people. The British see Lin as a backward despot who doesn't understand the principles of free trade, and they can't believe that anyone would choose moral principles over economic prosperity. You spend your evening listening to rumors about what Lin might do next. Some people think he'll negotiate with the British and work out some kind of compromise that allows limited opium trade under government supervision. Others believe he'll use military force to expel all foreign merchants from Chinese territory. A few optimists hope he'll somehow find a way to end the opium crisis without triggering a larger conflict. But you're starting to understand that this confrontation is bigger than anyone realizes. Lin isn't just fighting Chinese drug dealers and British smugglers. He's challenging the entire system of Western imperialism that treats non-European countries as markets to be exploited rather than sovereign nations to be respected. The British government has spent decades building a global empire based on the principle that British commercial interests take precedence over local laws and customs. They've used military force to open markets in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, always justifying their actions as spreading civilization and free trade. Now they're facing a Chinese official who rejects those justifications and demands that British merchants follow Chinese law like everyone else. This is a direct challenge to British imperial authority, and the British government can't allow it to succeed without undermining their position throughout Asia. If China can successfully resist British pressure and force British merchants to follow local laws, Other countries might try the same thing. The entire system of Western dominance depends on the assumption that European powers can impose their will on non-European societies. You fall asleep knowing that the comfortable world of manageable corruption and predictable exploitation is about to end. Lin Zexu represents something that the British have never encountered before. A non-European official who has the authority, competence, and moral conviction to enforce his country's laws against Western criminals. The British will have to choose between accepting Chinese legal authority or using military force to protect their drug dealers. Given the enormous profits involved and the imperial precedents at stake, the choice is obvious. They're going to fight, and they're going to win, because moral authority means nothing when faced with modern military technology. But that victory will come at a cost that neither side currently understands. The British will destroy Chinese resistance to the opium trade, but they'll also create a century of Chinese resentment against Western imperialism. They'll protect their drug profits, but they'll also demonstrate to the world that Western civilization is built on violence and exploitation rather than the moral principles they claim to represent. The Opium Crisis is about to become the first Opium War, and that war will reshape the global balance of power in ways that will echo for generations. But right now, in these final days before the shooting starts, you can still pretend that somehow reason and morality might prevail over greed and military force. Tomorrow, Lin Zexu will make his demands clear to the British merchants, and they'll make their refusal clear to him. The last chance for peaceful resolution will disappear, and China will discover that its moral authority means nothing against British gunboats. The most tragic thing about what's coming is how preventable it all was. If Britain had been willing to pay for Chinese goods with something other than addictive drugs, none of this would have been necessary. If Chinese officials had been able to resist corruption, the smuggling network never could have operated. If either side had been willing to compromise, war could have been avoided. But compromise requires understanding, and understanding requires respect, and respect is impossible when one side views the other as inferior beings whose laws and customs don't matter. The British see Chinese civilization as backward and corrupt, deserving whatever happens to it. The Chinese see British merchants as barbarian criminals who threaten everything decent about human society. These attitudes make peaceful coexistence impossible, which means that force will determine the outcome. And in 1839, British force is overwhelming compared to Chinese resistance. The country that invented gunpowder centuries ago is about to be defeated by a nation that has perfected the art of using gunpowder to kill people more efficiently. You drift off to sleep listening to the sounds of a world about to end. The Opium Crisis has already destroyed traditional Chinese society, but the war that's coming will destroy China's independence and dignity as well. The British will win their right to poison Chinese people with drugs, and they'll call it a victory for civilization and free trade. But they'll also create the conditions for a century of revolution, war, and upheaval that will eventually drive all Western powers out of China. The opium they're fighting to protect will become a symbol of everything Chinese people hate about foreign domination. The humiliation they're about to inflict will become the driving force behind Chinese nationalism and modernization. The British think they're fighting for commercial freedom and imperial prestige. They don't realize they're creating their own worst enemy, a China that will never forgive or forget what's about to happen. The Opium Crisis isn't just destroying Imperial China, it's creating modern China. And modern China will be very different from the corrupt, addicted society that Britain is currently exploiting. But that's a story for the distant future. Right now, in 1839, the immediate future is clear enough. Lin Zexu will confront the British merchants. They'll refuse his demands, and the British Empire will respond with overwhelming military force. The last independent Asian empire is about to learn what happens when you try to enforce your laws against people who have better guns than you do. It won't be pretty, but it will be educational, both for China and for the rest of the world watching these events unfold. The age of Western dominance through military superiority is about to reach its peak, but it's also about to plant the seeds of its own eventual destruction. The Opium Crisis will end with British victory, but that victory will cost them something they don't yet understand they're losing: the moral authority to claim that Western civilization represents progress and human dignity. When you use military force to protect drug dealers, you reveal something about your civilization that can never be hidden again. The British are about to win a war that will destroy their reputation forever, and they're too focused on immediate profits to understand what they're really sacrificing. Script continues, type continue, or just hit enter. Lin's letter to Queen Victoria never reaches her. Of course, because the British postal system isn't designed to handle moral philosophy from Chinese officials. Instead, it gets published in the Times, where British readers can enjoy a good laugh about backward foreigners who don't understand free trade. The letter is actually quite reasonable, asking whether Victoria would allow such a poisonous substance into her own country and requesting her cooperation in stopping the trade. But reasonable requests don't generate profits, so the letter becomes a curiosity rather than a catalyst for policy change. You're working as a messenger that day, carrying documents between different merchant houses, when you overhear British traders discussing Lin's letter in their private club. They're reading selected passages aloud in exaggerated Chinese accents, laughing at what they consider naive moral posturing. One merchant suggests that someone should write a response explaining the principles of free trade to these backward Orientals. Another jokes that maybe they should send Victoria some opium so she can understand why Chinese people love it so much. The casual racism is breathtaking, but it's also revealing. These men genuinely believe that Chinese people are fundamentally different from Europeans, that addiction and social destruction are somehow acceptable when they happen to foreigners. They've convinced themselves that they're bringing civilization to China through commerce, even when that commerce involves massive drug smuggling operations. Meanwhile, Lin is taking more concrete action. He's established a network of informants throughout Canton, offering rewards for information about opium dealers and smuggling operations. Children earn copper coins by reporting on suspicious boat movements. Shopkeepers get tax breaks for providing information about customers who spend unusually large amounts of silver. Even beggars are recruited to watch for the telltale signs of opium transactions. You deliver a message to one of these informants, a tea merchant who's been struggling to compete with opium-funded businesses. He tells you about the impossible position Lin has put him in. If he provides information about his competitors' drug connections, he might be able to survive economically. But if his competitors discover his cooperation with the authorities, they might retaliate violently. The opium trade has created a climate of fear where honest business requires courage that few people can afford. The information network is remarkably effective. Within weeks, Lin's agents are intercepting smuggling boats, arresting dealers, and confiscating opium supplies throughout the Pearl River Delta. The casual, open nature of the drug trade is suddenly replaced by paranoia and secrecy. Smugglers who once operated with impunity are now looking over their shoulders, wondering if their next customer might be a government informant. But the British merchants have their own network, and they're using it to monitor Lin's activities. They know which officials have been arrested, which informants are most active, and which smuggling routes are still operational. More importantly, they're coordinating their response through their diplomatic contacts in Macau and Hong Kong, preparing to escalate the confrontation beyond what any Chinese official has previously experienced. You spend an afternoon at the docks watching the subtle changes in how business is conducted. Legitimate cargo is being unloaded with unusual care and documentation as merchants try to demonstrate their compliance with Chinese law. But the opium ships are still anchored at Linton Island, their floating warehouses still full of drugs, their crews still waiting for the right moment to resume smuggling operations. The British strategy is becoming clear. They're treating Lin's crackdown as a temporary inconvenience that can be waited out or negotiated around. They assume that, like previous Chinese officials, Lin will eventually realize that stopping the opium trade is impossible and will settle for some face-saving compromise that allows business to continue with minor modifications. This fundamental misunderstanding of Lin's character and mission is about to create a crisis that neither side is prepared for. The British expect corruption and accommodation because that's what they've always encountered before. Lin expects moral authority and legal compliance because that's how government is supposed to work. Neither side can comprehend the other's perspective, which makes peaceful resolution impossible. The confrontation escalates when Lin takes the unprecedented step of cutting off all food supplies to the foreign quarter. British merchants who are accustomed to Chinese servants bringing their meals find themselves confined to their compounds without access to fresh food or water. This isn't just inconvenient. It's a direct challenge to British prestige and authority. You watch from a distance as the siege of the foreign quarter begins. Chinese authorities have surrounded the area with guards who prevent anyone from entering or leaving. Food vendors who usually serve the foreign community are turned away at checkpoints. Even letters and newspapers are blocked from entering the compound. The British merchants are effectively prisoners in their own trading posts. Inside the foreign quarter, panic is setting in. The British merchants have always assumed that their economic importance would protect them from serious government action. They've lived comfortably in Canton for years, insulated from the consequences of their illegal activities by their wealth and diplomatic status. Now they're discovering that moral authority can be more powerful than money when it's backed by genuine government commitment. The psychological pressure is intense. These men are accustomed to controlling their environment through bribes and threats. They're used to Chinese officials who defer to their wishes and accommodate their demands. Suddenly, they're facing an authority figure who treats them like common criminals and seems completely immune to their usual methods of influence. Captain Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, arrives from Macau to negotiate with Lin, but the meeting doesn't go as expected. Elliot expects diplomatic courtesy and face-saving compromises. Lin demands immediate surrender of all opium stocks and written guarantees that British merchants will never again smuggle drugs into China. There's no middle ground between these positions, no room for the kind of diplomatic maneuvering that usually resolves trade disputes. You're working as a translator during one of these meetings, and the cultural disconnect is painful to witness. Elliot keeps talking about free trade and commercial rights, concepts that make perfect sense within British imperial thinking. Lin keeps responding with moral arguments about the duty to protect Chinese people from foreign poison, principles that are fundamental to Confucian governance. They're speaking different languages, even when using the same words. The economic pressure on the British merchants is becoming unbearable. They have massive amounts of capital tied up in opium stocks that they can't sell. Their other trading activities are suspended because of the siege. Their Chinese business partners are being arrested or intimidated into ending their relationships. Every day of delay costs them thousands of pounds, money that represents not just individual profits, but also obligations to investors back in Britain. After 6 weeks of this standoff, the British merchants finally capitulate. They agree to surrender their opium stocks, over 20,000 chests containing more than 1,400 tons of the drug. It's a staggering amount, representing millions of dollars in street value, and involving virtually every British trading house in Canton. The surrender is complete and unconditional. exactly what Lin demanded from the beginning. But the victory comes with a hidden cost that Lin doesn't fully understand. By treating the opium as contraband to be destroyed rather than stolen property to be compensated, he's created a legal precedent that the British government can't accept. From the British perspective, their merchants have just been robbed of millions of pounds worth of legitimate cargo by a foreign government that refuses to recognize international law. You watch the destruction of the opium at Hummen, a ritual that takes 23 days and involves 500 workers. The drugs are mixed with lime and salt to neutralize their narcotic properties, then dumped into the sea outside the town. Lin composes a formal apology to the sea gods for polluting their realm, a gesture that demonstrates his deep concern for the spiritual consequences of the drug trade. The destruction is meant to be symbolic as well as practical. Lin wants to demonstrate that Chinese moral authority is stronger than British economic power, that the Qing Dynasty is still capable of enforcing its laws against foreign criminals. Every chest of destroyed opium represents a victory for traditional Chinese values over Western corruption. But the British see the destruction very differently. To them, it's the largest theft in commercial history, a violation of property rights that threatens the entire foundation of international trade. They're not thinking about moral philosophy or spiritual pollution. They're calculating the financial losses and planning their retaliation. The news of the opium destruction reaches London just as Parliament is debating Britain's China policy. The commercial lobby, led by firms with massive investments in the opium trade, demands immediate military intervention to protect British property rights and commercial interests. Opposition politicians argue that the government shouldn't use military force to protect drug dealers, but they're outnumbered by members who see this as a test of British imperial authority. You're not aware of these distant political debates, of course. You're dealing with the immediate aftermath of Lin's victory, which creates new problems even as it solves old ones. The destruction of the opium supply causes prices for the remaining drugs to skyrocket, making addiction even more expensive and desperate. Addicts who were barely managing their habits with cheap opium are now forced into crime and prostitution to afford the higher prices. The British merchants, meanwhile, are planning their revenge. They've withdrawn from Canton entirely, moving their operations to Macau and Hong Kong while they wait for military support from London. They're not accepting Lin's victory as permanent. They're treating it as a temporary setback that will be reversed as soon as British warships arrive to restore the proper balance of power. Lin interprets the British withdrawal as evidence that moral authority has triumphed over criminal enterprise. He reports to the emperor that the Opium Crisis has been successfully resolved through firm application of Chinese law and Confucian principles. Foreign merchants have been taught to respect Chinese sovereignty, and the drug trade has been permanently ended. But you can see signs that the victory is less complete than Lin believes. Opium is still being smuggled through other ports and river systems. Some of the destroyed drugs are being replaced by new shipments from India. The addiction crisis continues because the underlying demand hasn't been addressed. Only the supply has been temporarily disrupted. More ominously, British warships are gathering in Hong Kong and Singapore. Merchant vessels are being converted into troop transports. Military supplies are being stockpiled in British territories throughout Southeast Asia. The commercial interests that Lin has challenged aren't accepting defeat gracefully. They're preparing to escalate the conflict beyond anything the Chinese government has previously experienced. You hear rumors about these military preparations while working at the docks, where Chinese merchants with British connections are quietly liquidating their assets and preparing to flee. They know something that Lin doesn't understand. The British response to his moral victory will be military conquest, not diplomatic accommodation. The Qing military is completely unprepared for what's coming. Chinese forces are equipped with outdated weapons and trained in tactics that were effective against other Asian armies but useless against European military technology. The Imperial Navy consists mostly of river boats designed for internal security, not ocean-going warships capable of fighting British frigates. But the real problem isn't military weakness, it's conceptual blindness. Chinese leaders still think they're dealing with a trade dispute that can be resolved through negotiation and compromise. They don't understand that they've challenged the entire British imperial system, which depends on the assumption that European commercial interests take precedence over local laws and customs. You spend your evenings listening to conversations in tea houses where retired officials and elderly merchants discuss the situation. Their analysis is sophisticated, but completely wrong. They assume that Britain will eventually accept Chinese authority because resistance would be too expensive and diplomatically damaging. They believe that other European powers will support China's position because drug smuggling violates universal moral principles. These assumptions reflect a worldview where moral authority matters more than military power, where civilized nations respect each other's sovereignty regardless of commercial interests. It's a worldview that makes perfect sense within traditional Chinese political philosophy, but has nothing to do with the realities of European imperialism in the 19th century. The British Empire has spent decades using military force to open markets and protect commercial interests throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They fought wars to establish trading posts, imposed treaties to guarantee favorable commercial terms, and overthrown governments that interfered with British business operations. Their entire imperial system depends on the principle that military superiority gives them the right to dictate terms to weaker nations. Lin's successful resistance to British commercial pressure represents an unprecedented challenge to this system. If China can enforce its laws against British merchants, other countries might try the same thing. The entire structure of Western imperialism could collapse if non-European nations start believing that their sovereignty actually means something. You're walking home one evening when you encounter a group of British merchants who have returned to Canton under diplomatic protection. They're surveying the damage to their business operations and planning their comeback. One of them notices you listening and makes a comment that chills you to the bone. Don't worry, we'll be back soon enough, and next time we'll bring proper arguments. The proper arguments he's referring to are British warships, and they're already on their way. The First Opium War is about to begin, and it will demonstrate that moral authority means nothing when faced with overwhelming military superiority. China is about to learn that independence is a luxury that only militarily powerful nations can afford. But right now, in these final weeks before the shooting starts, you can still pretend that Lin's victory is permanent, that Chinese sovereignty has been successfully defended, that moral principles can triumph over commercial greed. The opium trade has been stopped, corrupt officials have been arrested, and foreign criminals have been expelled from Chinese territory. It's a beautiful dream, and it's about to become a nightmare that will last for more than a century. The British aren't coming back to negotiate or accommodate Chinese law. They're coming back to impose British law on China, and they have the military power to do it. The Opium Crisis is about to become the First Opium War, and that war will end with China's complete humiliation and subjugation to Western imperial interests. The drugs that Lin destroyed will be replaced by much larger quantities imported under the protection of British gunboats. The sovereignty he defended will be shredded by unequal treaties that give foreigners special legal privileges on Chinese soil. But the ultimate irony is that Lin's moral victory, brief though it is, will become the foundation for Chinese resistance to Western imperialism. The destruction of the opium at Hunnan will be remembered as the moment when China tried to defend itself against foreign aggression. Lin Zexu will become a national hero, a symbol of Chinese dignity in the face of Western bullying. The British think they're about to win a simple commercial dispute, They don't realize they're creating a Chinese national consciousness that will eventually drive all Western powers out of China. The humiliation they're about to inflict will become the motivation for Chinese modernization and revolution. The opium they're fighting to protect will become a symbol of everything Chinese people hate about foreign domination. You fall asleep listening to the sound of British warships gathering in the harbor, their presence a reminder that moral authority without military power is just an expensive form of suicide. Tomorrow will bring the beginning of the end for Imperial China, but it will also plant the seeds for the eventual rise of modern China. The British are about to win the battle and lose the war, but it will take them more than a century to understand what they've really accomplished. For now, they're just focused on protecting their drug profits and teaching uppity foreigners a lesson about the realities of global power. But reality has a way of changing, and the reality they're about to create will eventually consume them. The Opium Crisis isn't just ending Imperial China's independence. It's beginning modern China's long march back to greatness. The British just don't know it yet. The British fleet arrives in June 1840, and your first clue that everything is about to go catastrophically wrong is the sound. Not cannon fire or military drums, but something worse. The steady chug-chug of steam engines that don't care about wind direction or tide schedules. The HMS Nemesis and her sister ships can move against the current, can position themselves exactly where they want to be, and they want to be pointing their guns at your city. You're working at the docks when the first British warship rounds the bend in the Pearl River, and even the opium addicts stop drooling long enough to stare. This isn't like the merchant vessels they're used to seeing. This is a floating fortress that moves by itself, trailing black smoke and bristling with more cannons than most Chinese forts have ever seen. The ship's hull is iron, which means Chinese cannonballs will bounce off it like pebbles thrown at a wall. Your supervisor, a man who's been working these docks for 30 years, takes one look at the approaching fleet and quietly disappears. He's seen enough British merchants to know that when they bring warships, negotiations are over. You spend the rest of the morning watching Chinese officials scramble to figure out what to do about military technology that shouldn't exist, but clearly does. The British strategy is simple and devastating. They're not trying to conquer all of China, just enough of it to force the imperial government to accept their terms. They'll blockade key ports, capture strategic cities, and demonstrate that Chinese military forces are completely helpless against modern European weapons. It's economic warfare disguised as a trade dispute, and it's about to work perfectly. Your city's defenses were designed to repel other Chinese armies, not British steam-powered gunboats. The harbor fortifications consist of stone walls and bronze cannons that fire solid shot at short range. They're impressive-looking and completely useless against iron-hulled warships that can stand off at safe distances and pound the fortifications to rubble with explosive shells. You watch the first battle from a rooftop overlooking the harbor, and it's less a battle than a demonstration of technological superiority. The Chinese defenders fire their cannons bravely and accurately, hitting British ships multiple times. The cannonballs bounce off harmlessly or embed themselves in thick iron plating designed to absorb such impacts. Meanwhile, British guns fire explosive shells that detonate inside Chinese fortifications, turning stone walls into clouds of deadly fragments. The psychological impact is as devastating as the physical destruction. Chinese soldiers have never seen weapons that can kill people around corners or destroy fortifications from impossible distances. They're facing an enemy whose military technology is literally centuries ahead of their own, like fighting aliens who happen to speak English and really want to sell drugs. Your cousin, who serves in the Imperial Navy, returns from his first encounter with British warships in a state of shock that borders on catatonia. He describes watching his entire squadron get destroyed in less than an hour by a single British frigate that never came within range of Chinese guns. His ship's wooden hull was shattered by explosive shells, while British iron plating deflected every shot the Chinese fired in return. The speed of the British advance is demoralizing. Cities that should take weeks to besiege fall in days or hours to concentrated naval bombardment. Chinese commanders who have spent their careers studying traditional military tactics find themselves completely helpless against an enemy that can appear anywhere along the coast and destroy their positions before they can respond effectively. You're forced to evacuate your home when British ships position themselves to shell your neighborhood. The evacuation is chaos because nobody planned for this scenario. Chinese military doctrine assumed that foreign invaders would have to fight their way inland through defended positions. Instead, British ships can penetrate deep into river systems and threaten cities hundreds of miles from the ocean. The refugee camps outside the city are filled with people who can't understand what's happening to their country. These are farmers and shopkeepers who have never seen a steam engine, let alone a steam-powered warship with rifled cannons and explosive ammunition. They keep asking when the Imperial Army will drive the foreign devils back into the sea, not understanding that the Imperial Army has already been driven back into the mountains. British military superiority extends far beyond naval warfare. Their infantry carries percussion-lock muskets that fire faster and more accurately than Chinese matchlock weapons. Their artillery uses explosive shells instead of solid shot. Their commanders have recent combat experience from the Napoleonic Wars, while Chinese officers have been fighting mostly internal rebellions and border skirmishes with less advanced enemies. You find work as a messenger for Chinese military units retreating from the coast, and the disorganization is appalling. Commanders receive orders that are days out of date because the situation is changing faster than the imperial bureaucracy can process information. Supply lines collapse because British ships can interdict coastal shipping at will. Reinforcements get lost because maps don't account for the speed at which British forces can reposition themselves. The retreat inland becomes a rout when Chinese forces discover that British military technology gives them advantages even in land battles. British artillery can destroy Chinese fortifications for ranges where Chinese guns can't respond. British cavalry uses modern tactics and weapons that overwhelm traditional Chinese horsemen. Even British infantry, fighting in unfamiliar terrain, consistently defeats larger Chinese formations through superior firepower and training. You're present at a meeting where Chinese generals try to plan a counteroffensive, and the discussion is surreal. These are experienced military officers who understand traditional warfare perfectly, but they're trying to fight an enemy whose capabilities they can't comprehend. One general suggests using fire ships to attack British vessels, not understanding that steam engines can maneuver away from such attacks. Another proposes night raids against British positions, not knowing that British sentries have modern rifles that can kill accurately in darkness. The cultural misunderstanding works both ways, but it favors the British because superior military technology can overcome cultural ignorance, while the reverse isn't true. British commanders don't understand Chinese society or military traditions, but their ships can still sink Chinese junks and their cannons can still destroy Chinese fortifications. Chinese commanders don't understand British technology or tactics, and their traditional military advantages become useless against modern European warfare. The economic impact of the war is immediate and devastating. British naval blockades cut off China's coastal trade, which provides much of the imperial government's revenue. Internal commerce collapses because merchants can't move goods safely through war zones. Agricultural production suffers because farmers are either fighting, fleeing, or trying to avoid military requisitions from both sides. You witness the collapse of the traditional Chinese military system when imperial forces abandon Guangzhou without a fight. The city's defenses are formidable by traditional standards, but the commanders know They're facing an enemy that can destroy those defenses from beyond the range of Chinese weapons. Rather than sacrifice their men in hopeless battles, they withdraw and hope that diplomacy can achieve what military resistance cannot. But diplomacy requires negotiating from a position of strength, and China's position grows weaker with every British victory. The imperial government's strategy of trading space for time fails because British forces aren't trying to occupy Chinese territory permanently. They're demonstrating Chinese military helplessness to force political concessions, and every successful British attack makes those concessions more likely. The psychological warfare is as effective as the military campaign. British forces deliberately target symbols of Chinese authority: government buildings, military installations, imperial monuments. They're sending a message that Chinese sovereignty is an illusion that can be destroyed whenever Britain chooses to destroy it. The message is being received by Chinese officials who are beginning to understand that their empire is militarily defenseless against European aggression. You find yourself in Nanjing when British forces arrive to threaten the city, and the imperial court's panic is palpable. This isn't just another provincial capital under attack. It's the symbolic heart of Chinese civilization. If British ships can position themselves to bombard Nanjing, no Chinese city is safe from foreign military pressure. The psychological impact of this realization is devastating for Chinese leadership. The speed of the British advance has outpaced Chinese ability to organize effective resistance. Military units that might have fought effectively if given time to prepare and coordinate are instead being defeated piecemeal as they're encountered by British forces moving faster than Chinese communications can track. The war is being lost not just through technological inferiority, but through organizational collapse. Chinese attempts at asymmetric warfare prove ineffective because British forces are experienced at dealing with irregular resistance from colonial campaigns throughout the empire. Chinese irregulars using traditional weapons and tactics are no more effective against British military technology than regular Chinese forces. The British have spent decades perfecting methods for suppressing local resistance to imperial expansion. The final blow comes when British warships position themselves outside Nanjing with their guns trained on the city. The imperial government faces a choice between watching the ancient capital be reduced to rubble or accepting British terms for ending the war. The choice is obvious, but the terms are devastating for Chinese sovereignty and dignity. You're working as a clerk when the preliminary negotiations begin, and the British demands are more comprehensive than anyone expected. They want compensation for the destroyed opium, punishment of officials who enforce Chinese law against British merchants, territorial concessions for permanent British bases, and fundamental changes in how China conducts foreign trade. These aren't the terms of a commercial agreement. They're the terms of surrender by a defeated nation to its conquerors. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed on August 29, 1842, officially ends the First Opium War, but begins a century of Chinese humiliation at the hands of Western powers. The treaty forces China to pay massive indemnities for the privilege of being invaded, cede Hong Kong permanently to Britain, open 5 ports to British trade on British terms, and accept British extraterritoriality that exempts British subjects from Chinese law. But the most devastating clause isn't about territory or money. It's about principles. The treaty establishes that British commercial interests take precedence over Chinese sovereignty, that foreign merchants can operate in China under foreign law, and that the Chinese government cannot regulate foreign trade in ways that Britain considers unacceptable. China is being transformed from an independent empire into a British commercial colony. You're present at the signing ceremony aboard HMS Cornwallis, and the symbolism is unmistakable. Chinese officials are boarding a British warship to surrender their country's independence to foreign merchants who wanted to sell drugs to Chinese people. The ceremony is conducted according to European diplomatic protocols that treat China as a defeated enemy rather than a sovereign nation negotiating an agreement between equals. The immediate aftermath of the treaty reveals how completely China's position has been compromised. British merchants returned to Canton with military protection and legal immunity from Chinese law. The opium trade resumes on a larger scale than before, now protected by British gunboats and sanctioned by treaty provisions that prevent Chinese interference with British commerce. The social consequences are devastating for Chinese society. The drug epidemic that Lin Zexu temporarily suppressed returns with increased intensity as British merchants flood the market with cheap opium to recoup their wartime losses. Addiction rates soar beyond pre-war levels because the supply is now guaranteed by British military power and legal immunity for British drug dealers. You return to Canton to find a city transformed by defeat and foreign occupation. British merchants operate with impunity under the protection of British naval forces. Chinese officials who try to enforce Chinese law against British subjects are overruled by British consular courts. The Cohong system has been replaced by direct British commercial control over foreign trade. The economic impact extends far beyond the immediate costs of the war and indemnities. China's trade deficit with Britain increases dramatically as opium imports surge while Chinese exports remain constrained by British commercial preferences. Silver continues flowing out of China to pay for British drugs, creating monetary instability and inflation throughout the Chinese economy. The precedent established by British victory attracts other Western powers who demand similar concessions from the weakened Chinese government. France, the United States, and other European nations negotiate their own unequal treaties that further restrict Chinese sovereignty and create additional foreign enclaves exempt from Chinese law and taxation. You find work with one of the new British trading firms that have established operations under the treaty system, and the casual arrogance of the new colonial order is breathtaking. British merchants who were recently hiding from Chinese authorities in the foreign quarter now treat Chinese officials as subordinates who exist to facilitate British commercial interests. The new British Hong Kong colony becomes a base for expanded operations throughout China and a symbol of permanent Chinese territorial loss. Unlike the temporary military occupation of Chinese cities during the war, Hong Kong represents permanent annexation of Chinese territory by a foreign power. It's a visible reminder that Chinese sovereignty can be permanently diminished by foreign military action. The treaty's extraterritoriality provisions create a legal system where foreign criminals are immune from Chinese justice while Chinese people remain subject to foreign commercial pressure. British opium dealers who poison Chinese communities cannot be prosecuted in Chinese courts, while Chinese officials who interfere with British trade can be punished through diplomatic and military pressure. You watch the resumption of large-scale opium smuggling under British naval protection, and the operation is now more efficient and profitable than ever. British merchants no longer need to bribe Chinese officials or worry about government interference. They can import drugs openly through treaty ports under the protection of British law and British gunboats. The addiction crisis that devastated Chinese society before the war returns with increased intensity because the supply is now unlimited and legally protected. Families that were beginning to recover from drug-related losses find themselves facing renewed addiction problems as cheap opium floods back into Chinese markets. The psychological impact on Chinese society is profound. The war has demonstrated that China's traditional military superiority over neighboring countries means nothing against European military technology. The unequal treaties have shown that Chinese law and sovereignty can be overruled by foreign commercial interests backed by foreign military power. You're working in a government office when reports arrive about the broader implications of China's defeat. Other Asian countries are watching to see whether Chinese submission to Western pressure will be followed by similar demands on their own governments. The balance of power in Asia is shifting dramatically as Western military superiority becomes apparent. The opium that Lin Zexu destroyed at Humen has been replaced by much larger quantities imported under British military protection. The moral authority that briefly triumphed over commercial greed has been crushed by military force. The precedent has been established that Western commercial interests can override Asian sovereignty through superior firepower. But the ultimate irony is becoming apparent even as British merchants celebrate their victory. The humiliation of the First Opium War is creating a Chinese national consciousness that didn't exist before foreign invasion. The destruction of Chinese military power is motivating Chinese interest in Western military technology. The collapse of Chinese sovereignty is inspiring Chinese determination to reclaim independence. You hear discussions in tea houses and government offices about the need for fundamental changes in Chinese society and government. The traditional assumption that moral authority and cultural superiority provide adequate defense against foreign aggression has been shattered by British cannons. Chinese intellectuals are beginning to consider whether China needs to adopt Western technology and methods to defend itself against Western imperialism. The British think they've solved the China problem by demonstrating overwhelming military superiority and imposing favorable commercial terms. They don't understand that they've created the China problem by showing Chinese people that their traditional civilization cannot protect them against foreign aggression. The victory that protects British drug profits is also motivating Chinese modernization efforts that will eventually challenge Western dominance throughout Asia. The immediate future is clear enough. More opium, more addiction, more foreign commercial control over Chinese economic life. British merchants will prosper, Chinese addicts will suffer, and the Chinese government will be too weakened by unequal treaties to provide effective protection for its people. But the longer-term consequences are already visible to anyone willing to see them. Chinese scholars are studying Western military technology and political systems. Chinese officials are questioning traditional methods of governance and defense. Chinese merchants are learning Western commercial practices to compete with foreign traders. The First Opium War has ended with complete British victory, but that victory has planted seeds that will eventually grow into Chinese resistance, revolution, and renewal. The humiliation of 1842 will become the motivation for Chinese efforts to reclaim national strength and independence. The Opium Crisis that destroyed Imperial China is also creating the conditions for the emergence of modern China. You fall asleep in a city that's no longer fully Chinese, where British law protects. British drug dealers and Chinese sovereignty has been reduced to managing whatever internal affairs foreign powers choose not to control directly. The opium smoke still drifts through the streets, but now it carries the additional smell of gunpowder and defeat. The crisis that began with British merchants wanting to balance their tea trade has ended with the complete subordination of Chinese independence to Western commercial interests. The moral authority that Lin Zexu represented has been proven inadequate against modern military technology. The traditional Chinese assumption that civilization could triumph over barbarism has been shattered by British cannons firing explosive shells into Chinese cities. But somewhere in the ruins of Chinese sovereignty, something new is being born. The humiliation of the Opium Wars will become the foundation for Chinese nationalism. The military defeats will motivate Chinese military modernization. The unequal treaties will inspire Chinese determination to reclaim their country's independence and dignity. The British have won their right to sell drugs to Chinese people, but they've also created their most dangerous enemy, a China that understands the realities of global power and is determined to never again be victimized by foreign military superiority. The Opium Crisis is ending, but the Chinese Revolution is just beginning. The British have won their right to sell drugs to Chinese people, but they've also created their most dangerous enemy, a China that understands the realities of global power and is determined to never again be victimized by foreign military superiority. The Opium Crisis is ending, but the Chinese Revolution is just beginning. You wake up the next morning, and the first thing you notice is that the British flag is flying over the customs house where Chinese officials used to collect taxes. The second thing you notice is that your neighbor is openly smoking opium on his front step because nobody's going to arrest him anymore. The British merchants have made it clear that interfering with their customers' drug habits is bad for business, and business is the only law that matters now. Your breakfast consists of rice that tastes vaguely of defeat, and tea that costs twice what it did last month, because the British are now controlling the trade routes and charging whatever they feel like charging. You eat mechanically while watching British soldiers patrol your streets with the casual authority of people who own everything they can see. They're not particularly brutal or aggressive. They just act like you don't exist unless you're directly useful to their commercial operations. The transformation of your city is happening with breathtaking speed. Chinese signs are being replaced with English ones. Chinese law is being replaced with British commercial regulations. Chinese authority is being replaced with British consular courts that exist to protect British interests and British citizens from having to deal with Chinese legal systems. You're becoming a foreigner in your own country, and the process is so smooth and efficient that you almost admire the British for their organizational skills. You walk to work past a new British trading post that's been built on the site of a demolished Chinese temple. The symbolism isn't subtle, but then again, the British aren't trying to be subtle. They're trying to demonstrate that their civilization has permanently replaced yours, that their gods of commerce and military technology have defeated your gods of tradition and moral authority. The message is being received by every Chinese person who has to walk past that building every day. Your job now involves working for a British firm that's importing opium under the protection of the new treaty system. The work isn't particularly difficult, just soul-crushingly humiliating. You spend your days helping foreign drug dealers poison your own people, while those same drug dealers lecture you about the benefits of free trade and modern civilization. The pay is good because the British need Chinese employees who can navigate local customs and language, but the money tastes like blood in your mouth. The office where you work is a study in casual colonial arrogance. British merchants discuss Chinese people like livestock, debating whether this province or that city would be more profitable for expanded opium distribution. They use racial slurs so casually that they clearly don't consider Chinese people human enough to be insulted by them. You smile and nod and take their money while fantasizing about various creative forms of revenge that you'll never be able to implement. The new colonial order operates with clockwork efficiency. British ships dock at Chinese ports without paying Chinese customs duties. British merchants sell British goods without following Chinese commercial regulations. British citizens commit crimes without facing Chinese courts. Meanwhile, Chinese people who interfere with British business face immediate retaliation from British consular authorities backed by British military force. You deliver documents to the new British consulate, a fortress-like building designed to demonstrate British permanence and Chinese subordination. Inside, British officials process complaints from British merchants about Chinese people who have been insufficiently cooperative with British commercial interests. The complaints are trivial. Things like Chinese workers demanding higher wages or Chinese officials asking to see proper documentation, but they're treated with the seriousness of diplomatic incidents. The speed with which Chinese authority has evaporated is stunning. Government offices that once buzzed with activity now sit half empty because Chinese officials have been stripped of most of their powers. The remaining officials spend their time implementing British directives rather than Chinese policy. They're administrators of their own subjugation, and they know it, which makes them either quietly furious or openly collaborationist, depending on their personalities and financial situations. The economic transformation is even more dramatic than the political changes. Chinese merchants who used to compete with British traders are now working as their junior partners, handling local distribution for British imports, while the British control the profitable international trade. It's a colonial economic model where Chinese people provide cheap labor while British people extract the profits. Your cousin, who used to run a successful silk trading business, now works as a warehouse manager for a British firm that imports opium and exports Chinese goods at prices set in London rather than Canton. He makes more money than he did as an independent merchant, but he's also completely dependent on British commercial decisions made by people who consider him a useful but replaceable asset. The psychological adjustment is difficult for someone who used to be his own boss. The social consequences of the new order are becoming apparent as well. Chinese families that resist British commercial pressure find themselves economically isolated. Chinese officials who try to maintain Chinese legal traditions discover that their authority has been transferred to British consular courts. Chinese merchants who refuse to cooperate with British firms watch their competitors prosper under British protection. You spend your lunch break in a restaurant where the conversation revolves around accommodation and resistance. Some patrons argue that working with the British is the only way to survive economically. Others insist that collaboration with foreign oppressors is moral suicide, regardless of the financial benefits. Most people just eat quietly and avoid discussing politics because the British have made it clear that anti-British sentiment is bad for business. The opium trade under British protection is operating on a scale that dwarfs anything seen during the smuggling era. British merchants are importing the drug openly through treaty ports, distributing it through networks of Chinese dealers who operate under British legal immunity, and collecting profits that flow directly back to London investors. The addiction crisis that briefly subsided during Lin Zexu's crackdown is returning with unprecedented intensity. You walk home through neighborhoods where the social fabric is visibly disintegrating under the renewed drug epidemic. Families that were beginning to recover from addiction-related losses are sliding back into the cycle of drug dependency and financial ruin. Children who had started attending school again are back on the streets because their parents are spending education money on opium. The brief period of hope that followed Lin's successful suppression of the drug trade has been replaced by despair that's deeper than anything experienced before the war. The medical consequences of mass opium addiction are becoming more severe as the supply increases and the quality decreases. British merchants are cutting their product with cheaper substances to maximize profits, creating health problems that go beyond simple drug dependency. Users are developing lung diseases from smoking adulterated opium, skin conditions from contaminated pipes, and digestive problems from the various chemicals used to process the drug for market. But the psychological impact is even worse than the physical deterioration. The knowledge that their government cannot protect them from foreign drug dealers has created a sense of helplessness that permeates Chinese society. People aren't just addicted to opium, they're addicted to the idea that resistance is futile and accommodation with foreign oppression is the only realistic option. You attend a meeting of local merchants who are discussing how to adapt to the new economic reality. The conversation is depressing because it revolves entirely around how to serve British commercial interests more efficiently. Nobody talks about competing with British firms or challenging British economic control. The discussion focuses on how to become better junior partners in a system designed to extract wealth from China for the benefit of British investors. The educational system is being transformed as well. Chinese schools that used to teach traditional classics and moral philosophy are now emphasizing English language and Western commercial practices. The imperial examination system that has produced competent administrators for centuries is being supplemented with British-style education designed to create Chinese managers for British firms. The cultural implications are staggering, but the economic pressures are irresistible. Your younger brother, who's studying at one of these reform schools, comes home speaking English phrases and discussing British political theories. He's not becoming British, exactly, but he's becoming something that isn't traditionally Chinese either. He's part of a generation that's growing up assuming that Western civilization is superior to Chinese civilization because Western military technology proves superior to Chinese military technology. The British aren't content with economic and political control. They're also working to establish cultural dominance. British missionaries are building schools and hospitals that provide better services than Chinese institutions, demonstrating Western superiority through practical improvements in people's lives. The message is clear. British civilization works better than Chinese civilization, and Chinese people will be better off if they abandon their traditions and adopt Western methods. You visit one of these mission schools, and the experience is deeply unsettling. The Chinese children are being taught English history, British political philosophy, and Christian theology, while their own cultural traditions are dismissed as backward superstitions. They're learning to think of themselves as Chinese people who happen to live in China, rather than as inheritors of a great civilization that deserves respect and preservation. The speed of this cultural transformation is accelerating because the British have made traditional Chinese education economically irrelevant. Knowledge of classical Chinese literature doesn't help you get a job with a British trading firm. Understanding Confucian philosophy doesn't prepare you for the new colonial economy. Chinese parents are faced with the choice of giving their children a traditional education that will leave them economically disadvantaged, or a Western education that will help them prosper under foreign domination. The long-term implications are becoming apparent to Chinese intellectuals who understand what's happening to their civilization. They're watching their country's political independence, economic autonomy, and cultural identity being systematically dismantled by a foreign power that views Chinese people as markets rather than humans. The process is so thorough and efficient that resistance seems impossible, but the alternative is national extinction. You attend a lecture by one of these intellectuals, a scholar who's trying to analyze the causes of China's defeat and the requirements for eventual recovery. His analysis is brutally honest about Chinese military and technological inferiority, but he also argues that temporary defeat doesn't have to mean permanent subjugation. He points to examples of other countries that have adopted Western technology while preserving their cultural identity and political independence. The scholar's message is that China needs to learn from the West without becoming Western, to adopt foreign technology while preserving Chinese values, to modernize its military and economy while maintaining its civilization's distinctive characteristics. It's an appealing vision, but it requires a level of national unity and determination that seems impossible in a society that's been traumatized by military defeat and is currently being systematically corrupted by foreign economic incentives. The British, meanwhile, are expanding their operations beyond the original treaty ports. They're negotiating additional commercial concessions, establishing trading posts in previously closed areas, and generally treating the Treaty of Nanjing as a starting point rather than a final settlement. Their appetite for Chinese markets and Chinese resources appears to be unlimited, and their military superiority makes resistance seem futile. You're working late one evening when you overhear British merchants discussing their plans for the next phase of China penetration. They're talking about railroad construction, mining operations, and manufacturing facilities that would give them control over China's internal transportation, natural resources, and industrial development. These aren't just commercial ventures. They're the infrastructure of permanent colonial control. The conversation is conducted with casual assumption that Chinese opinion is irrelevant to British planning. They discuss Chinese labor as a resource to be exploited, Chinese land as property to be acquired, and Chinese markets as territories to be conquered through economic rather than military means. The racism is so complete that they literally don't consider Chinese people as participants in decisions about China's future. But there are signs of resistance beginning to emerge from unexpected quarters. Chinese merchants who are prospering under British protection are also learning Western business methods and technological capabilities. Chinese students who are attending British schools are also gaining access to Western political ideas about nationalism and self-determination. Chinese officials who are implementing British directives are also observing British administrative methods and military organization. You notice these changes in your daily interactions with people who are adapting to the new colonial system. They're learning English and Western customs, but they're also quietly discussing what they're learning and how it might be used to serve Chinese rather than British interests. The collaboration with foreign oppressors is real, but it's not necessarily permanent or complete. Your neighbor, who works as a translator for the British consulate, returns home each evening with stories about British weaknesses and limitations that aren't apparent to casual observers. He's learning about British military logistics, financial constraints, and political divisions that create opportunities for eventual Chinese resistance. His collaboration with British authorities is providing him with intelligence that could someday be used against those same authorities. The same process is happening throughout Chinese society. People who are working with the British are also learning from the British. They're discovering that Western military technology can be acquired and copied, that Western political methods can be adapted for Chinese purposes, that Western economic systems can be modified to serve Chinese rather than British interests. The humiliation of the Opium Wars is creating a Chinese national consciousness that didn't exist before foreign invasion. People who previously thought of themselves as inhabitants of particular provinces or members of particular social classes are beginning to think of themselves as Chinese, people whose country has been invaded by foreigners. The shared experience of defeat and occupation is creating shared identity and shared purpose. You fall asleep to the sound of silver coins changing hands, opium pipes being lit, and British merchants planning tomorrow's drug shipments. The crisis that started with tea has ended with your entire civilization being sold to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder, as it turns out, was always going to be the people with the biggest guns. The opium smoke still drifts through your streets, but now it carries the additional scent of defeat and foreign occupation. Your neighbor is still passed out in his doorway, but now there's a British flag hanging above him. The addiction crisis continues, the corruption spreads, and the silver keeps flowing out of China to pay for British poison. But somewhere in the ruins of imperial authority, something new is stirring. Chinese people are learning that moral superiority means nothing without military power. They're discovering that ancient wisdom can't stop modern warships. They're realizing that if China wants to survive as anything more than a British drug market, it's going to have to change everything about how it thinks, fights, and governs itself. The British have won their war, but they've also created their most dangerous enemy, a humiliated China that understands exactly what it needs to do to never be humiliated again. The opium crisis is ending, but the Chinese Revolution is just beginning. Sleep well, and try not to dream about what happens when the student finally surpasses the teacher.